Welcome to the Behaviour Smart podcast, brought to you by Behaviour Smart, the incident recording system that improves behaviour. In this episode, we will be talking to Jack Pattinson and Matthew Rawcliffe. Jack is a trainer, speaker, and school support partner specialising in inclusion, belonging, and behaviour. Matthew is a person with lived experience who had a turbulent time in education and then found success doing a job he loves. Today they are going to talk to us about how we can improve inclusion for children and young people across our services.
Hello and welcome to the second instalment of the Behaviour Smart podcast. My name's Dean Cotton. I am a trainer, author and behaviour consultant, and today I am very, very honoured to have on the Behaviour Smart podcast Mr. Jack Pattinson and Matthew Rawcliffe. So good evening you two and welcome to the Behaviour Smart podcast. How are you today?
I'm good.
All good, thank you.
Good. So Jack, we'll start off with Jack, and Matthew, feel free to jump in. Can you tell us a little bit about the work you do in promoting inclusion in our services?
Yeah, so I've kind of come at where I am in my career now from sort of two angles, where I empathise with kind of Matthew's experience, because I had a pretty tricky time at school myself, some down to, the kind of inclusion efforts that were made by my schools growing up, and some by just, the way that my brain worked during my time in education. So I left school kind of wanting to make damn sure that those experiences didn't happen for other kids, and that's what brought me to working with young people. So I'm on a bit of a mission. I've got a bit of an obsession with the word belonging. So a lot of the work that I do is around understanding how do we offer experiences to children, to young people, that allows them to belong, to really, truly, all the nitty gritty, to actually belong in the communities, the schools, the services that they're part of. And what does that mean? What does that do to the way we look at relationships and how we support behaviour, how we promote inclusion? How do we, I call it a kind of culture of kindness. How do we make that a real thing and not just something that sounds really sort of airy-fairy and a kind of something we can work towards but never quite get to?
I mean, it is quite interesting because we all have this sort of need to belong, and I don't know if any of the listeners heard the previous podcast we did with Kieran. Kieran was a student that I supported who ended up, to a certain extent, committing offences as a need to belong. So he wanted to belong to somebody, and that happened to be sort of gangs of people. And belonging is it's an important word, and it's really important that we get that right. But you're right in terms of how do we do that? How do we create those environments where people feel like they do belong and belong to the right groups, to the right people? Matthew, did in your experiences when you were in school, did you feel like you belonged there?
No, not one bit. I never felt like I was in the right group. I never felt like I was, it just didn't feel right. I missed school a lot due to just people not understanding me. And it was never taught how to understand people.
Yeah, because it comes down to I suppose it comes down to positive relationships as well, isn't it? It's about that we've got positive relationships with people in the services that we're attending. So we need to, we will get that need to belong if we've got positive relationships, surely. I don't know. What do you think about that, Jack?
I think I totally get how Matthew feels, because I think it's that idea, isn't it, that when we talk about inclusion, it's a big buzzword at the minute. There's lots of talk around how the Ofsted framework in education is going to change to look at inclusion. But it can often be a really big banner term, and sometimes people like to say, I'm a really inclusive person. But it's again, challenging that question of what does that actually mean? Who is it that experience impacts? Because for me, something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about after my time in school, I was so aware that everybody saw me as something different. And I couldn't always quite pinpoint what that was, but it was like those really organic moments that we hope for children and young people in school to happen, of those, those natural selection of games at, play and break times in earlier years and things like that, it always felt very, very different and very separate and very othered. And if that's not if that's not something that's reflected on, if that's not something that's actively taught, when we build those positive relationships, we understand how and why people are different and what that means to those relationships. And the answer there is it means nothing.
Yeah.
That it doesn't. That there is no noticeable. Oh my goodness, that's such a stark difference. Why does it matter? Why is it going to be something we refer to talk about, to notice even?
Yeah, I mean, and that's what I was saying to you before we started recording, that, like, to me, somebody being different, we're all different, we're all different. There's nobody the same. We're all different, and we all have different preferences. And what I was saying to you before we started talking is that, like, I sometimes when I go to Nando's, I'd rather have the spicy rice than the fries. It's just a preference. It's my preference, and that, in my eyes, should be, I don't even, to a certain extent, not even celebrated, but just accepted. Really, that we just accept that everybody's different. I really don't understand. I see it a lot in my work where people are treated differently because of different needs. But different preferences, I don't really understand why there has to be any difference. And Matthew, can I just ask you, what would have made because I'm quite interested in this idea of inclusion and what do we mean by that, but what would have made your life in school better than it was?
Education, I think, is where it mainly should have been, and it wasn't. So everyone got taught about my community, everyone got taught it, but no one went into depth. Like, just because I like men doesn't mean that I like every man. Like, for some reason in my life, if I've always been a friend with a man, it's always been like, oh, he might try it on with me, and it just wasn't taught. And then it doesn't help that the older generation are teaching their kids that it's wrong. It really, so then that carries on, and then it's weird how we're not educated on, just because I like boys don't mean I like every boy, and just because she likes girls don't mean that she wants to be with every girl. Makes no sense.
Like, every boy doesn't want to be with every girl, and every girl doesn't want to be with every boy.
Yeah.
But there is that sort of thing, isn't there, where people say, "Oh no, he's gay, then I better not talk to him."
Weird.
It's interesting, isn't it, the way that it's positioned? I think sometimes when people like to talk about how inclusive they are or how inclusive their provision is, they can often reel off all the ways in which they think they're inclusive. But it's often those really subtle moments where, like, to use your example there, Matthew, that often when we talk about relationships, there's this kind of default idea around relationships. And when we talk about relationships that aren't heterosexual, that's a kind of separate conversation. We'll get to that later. We will cover it. We cover all relationships, but it's this idea, that subtle undertone of the fact that
it's different.
Absolutely, and even the way that it's positioned in lesson content, in curriculum maps, it positions it as something slightly different, and that's the undercurrent that starts to build this idea that what lots of people, if they are heterosexual, will experience is this idea of normal, and that everything else that we talk about is something different. It's something less than, and that less than I find is a real trigger for me. When I was watching coverage around same-sex marriage referendums and things like that, a big argument there was that by allowing non-heterosexual couples to marry, that it was devaluing marriage and that it was less than. But it's those teeny tiny moments that plant those seeds.
It is, and it's so interesting. I mean, I suppose, really, we talk to schools and children's homes or whatever services, and they're saying, we're inclusive. We think about, well, what do they mean by that? But more importantly, what I'm trying to get at here is for people watching this podcast, for head teachers and heads of cares listening to this or watching this podcast, what can they do? What should they be doing to address this issue that needs addressing, which shouldn't even really be an issue? So, I mean, in your sort of work, Jack, if you're working with heads and people like that to address these issues, what would your advice be to them?
So it's an absolute journey. I think, when I reflect on my time at school and where we're at now, arguably some progress has been made. I'd love to say it was much more advanced than it is, but I think a lot about. I'm a bit of a language snob, and one of the things that used to really keep me up at night when I was at school is the way that anytime relationships were talked about, when we talked about what you were going to do in life, you'd get a job, you'd find a partner. You wouldn't find a partner, you'd find a wife. You'd settle down and you'd have children. It was really suggestive about the kind of experience that you'd have, and that it was a very heteronormative experience that was kind of referred to. So it was those tiny moments that reminded me, before I'd even considered coming out, that this was going to be like a kind of hurdle to overcome. And actually, when we think about inclusion and how we forge those relationships with young people in our services, we talk about connection. We think about, building moments of connection, and those subtle language changes. The way that we talk. Do we assume when somebody's talking about a significant other? Do we say, "Oh, so have you got yourself a boyfriend?" Now, that might not be the kind of topic of conversation we're having between a practitioner and a young person in service. But it's that assumption. Again, it's those moments. And those are actually, upon a bit of reflection, quite easy changes to make. But we've got to be up for listening. We've got to be reflective on the information that people who are living and breathing those experiences in our provisions every day are sharing with us. And that what we're not doing is sort of... I remember I reported an issue of bullying, and I was pretty worn down by this point. And I was reassured again and again that it was going to be sorted out. There was no change in experience apart from the Monday after the weekend. I went back into school, and we were brought in onto to what they called an emergency assembly. So assemblies at our secondary school only happened on Wednesdays and Fridays, but there was an emergency assembly on the Monday, and it was an assembly all about how if somebody's gay, that's all right, and all I could feel. So we had this sort of staggered seating. It was very exciting because it came out electrically with a remote, and we were all sat, and I was sat at the top row. I used to like to tuck myself right out of the way, and all I could feel, gradually one by one, in a bit of a domino effect, was people turning around going, "Well, this is definitely something Jack said." And I want to believe that there was maybe a good intention behind that kind of approach, but it was tokenistic. It was to say that something had been done, but it did nothing to change my experience. So it didn't alter the way I felt about school, my peers, myself.
And I think that's the problem sometimes, isn't it, in schools, that we want to do something, but I don't think it was, based on what you're just saying, I don't think it was something that the school, they thought they were doing the right thing.
Yeah.
Because they hadn't got the knowledge to sort of do the right thing. And that's one of the issues that we come across quite a lot in all different aspects of our work. And dealing with bullying that way could possibly lead to more bullying. It's likely to lead to more bullying, and bullying because of who you are is just, I find it really bizarre. I'm quite interested in Matthew's views on, or more, if it's okay to talk to you about this, Matthew.
Yeah,
that's a really turbulent time for you at school. But what sort of experiences did you have at school in terms of?
Yeah, so I got bullied probably majority of all the way through high school. I was fine primary, no one, because when you're young, you don't really care who likes who. And at that point, I didn't even know I liked lads. But I think when you are older and you're starting to make relationships with like girls, boys, like that sort of thing, that's when people realise that I wasn't interested in girls. I was more interested about what the boys were doing. And then it started going bad. I was bullied quite severely to the point where it affected my mental health quite bad. But yeah, it was just awful. And there was some things that school did help with, but it should have happened a long time ago. And there were some things that they just didn't change.
So when you say there's some things that school did help with, can you sort of share with us some things that you feel that school did quite well?
So I always had this one teacher that you'd see every day, like a form tutor, and she was just like, she knew what was happening. Everyone knew. This is the problem. When I was off ill because I couldn't come into school, there was an email sent round saying he's not in school because he's being bullied and he can't come in. But whatever they was using to do the register also said an email underneath the register on the whiteboard that said Matthew's absence, reason why. And everyone whose class I was in saw Matthew's reason for thingy. So everyone knew why I was off. And then when I came into school, they were just like, what's wrong? What's wrong? And that made it 10 times worse. But they did help. Like, I cannot fault the teachers one bit, but there is some that sort of, I wouldn't say use the word encourage, but they did nothing. So I would count that as encouragement. But like in terms of actually helping, in my last year of high school, instead of getting changed in the boys' changing rooms, I got put in a visitors one because I used to dread PE with a passion, because every time I'd get changed, people would be like, don't look at me. Like, they would always think that I found them attractive when in reality they were ugly as hell. So in my last year, I got put into visitors' changing rooms to help. That did help because it made PE more bearable. But then people realised that I was going for 10 minutes and getting changed and coming back. So that made even more questions. But yeah, there were certain things that helped, certain things that didn't.
It's very difficult, isn't it? Because I was thinking as you were saying that, you know, putting a different changing room, like, yeah, to a certain extent, that's going to help. But to another extent, it's going to say, no, Matthew is different. And
yeah.
And it's about individuals and what you want, isn't it, as an individual? And I think, you know, from what you were just saying there, Matthew, I think one of the best piece of advice we could give to schools is, like, listen to your students and know them, because we're all different. You know, I've got 3 children, and you don't manage or speak to one of them how you would speak to the other. They're all very, very different. I think this is one of the things that we have in schools, and one of the things that's a bugbear of mine is like these try and catch-all behaviour management systems that might work for some but not for other people. And it's the same with it. So what works for you might not work with somebody else. If I were put in a changing room by myself, that would probably make me feel more isolated. But it's a tough decision. It's difficult, isn't it? Because some of our schools, there's so many children in there that we've got to try and help and support, and everybody's different. I mean, I don't know, Jack. What would you say in terms of what Matthew was saying there about having a different changing room?
It's arguably, hopefully, well intended, but you're right. It does. I always used to talk about this idea that sometimes the help that was offered to me often came from a good place, but it kind of shone a spotlight on me. And actually, for some kids, it made them more aware of me than they were before. And actually, I remember a lot as a kind of kid and young person just wanting to fly under the radar. So actually, you know, those strategies that are designed to help, often, you know, if just because the intention's good doesn't mean the experience is also.
Yeah.
But it's hard in those moments where I think one of the key messages that I'm spending a lot of time delivering to schools at the moment, when I've stopped picking at language and I've stopped reviewing curriculum maps and things like that, is I think a lot, and I'm going to really terribly misquote here, but I think a lot about that quote of, you know, when are we going to stop asking how children have fallen into the river before we walk upstream and stop them falling in? In that actually, and I've probably done that quite a really disservice, but this idea that where do we buy into this issue? Where do we buy into this idea that it's absolutely acceptable for me to feel like I can comment on who you are, you know, that I can go about looking to hurt you, and with my, you know, behavior hat on, I'm really aware that, you know, sometimes the behavior that we and folk have had to endure is very communicative of their own experiences. But what are the support strategies that exist from day dot in primary education, right the way from early years, where we're thinking about this, the way in which we develop relationships, the way in which we call that out? I remember being told all the time, and I've probably said this to kids I've taught, that, you know, we want you to know wrong from right, and to know to walk away, you know, to know to come and tell us when something's wrong. But the social impact that kind of experience has is huge, because the requirement for a system like that to exist successfully is that the first thing said when I say, actually, I don't think this is right, is that everybody's not jumping on me going, no, Jack's a grass now, we need to treat him differently.
Yeah.
I watched this really interesting lesson observation, and it was filmed in an American provision, where his member of staff was working with, I'm going to guess sort of 6-7 year old children and young people, where she was talking about what she called the 30-second rule. That if you felt inclined to talk about somebody, if it was something that they couldn't change in 30 seconds or less, then it wasn't for you to talk about. That it wasn't for you to use against them or to chastise them with. You know, because I remember being told a lot about this idea that being gay or being not heterosexual is a choice. And if there was a choice to be made, oh my goodness, we wouldn't have gone for the difficult one. You know, it's that thing of actually, I'd have loved for a quiet life where I could have just flown under the radar and just been left alone. But this idea that I can't change the way that I am, and we kind of create this version of ourselves. And what I found as I've got older and started working with children is that then we start this process of kind of unpicking this version we created for everybody else to just stay safe and to try and fly under the radar. And now I'm trying to figure out, or have figured out, actually, who is it that I am, and what is it that I like, and, you know, what kind of people do I want to be friends with?
I suppose it's a sort of two main things that we need to be thinking about doing in education, and sort of educating people from a very, very early age. I'm talking, you know, nursery, that everybody's different, and that's what makes life so wonderful. And also, we're thinking about, I've lost what I was going to say there. I had something really cool to say, but it's just gone. But making, you know, but getting, when there are issues where people are sort of isolated, that we support them by talking to them and listening to them and finding out what they want us to do. Because at the end of the day, education, schools, is not just about what GCSEs you get. It's about education. It's about educating people about life, to give them everything that they need to move on and be happy. And so I think, you know, I was interested in what you were saying, Jack, about language, because we all do that sometimes. You know, we all say things that we go, oh, actually, that's not quite right. But there's education around that, isn't there, as well? Around, you know, we don't say things to upset people. You know, if we're talking about, you know, I think about like my mum and dad and the things that they say, because they are quite old-fashioned, and sometimes they might say things that you think, oh, mum, you can't say that these days, you know. But they're not nasty people. They're good people. They're very, very good people that have just had a different life experiences and education. So maybe if we could address that small language, because that small language does make a difference, and educate people from a very, very early age about everybody being different, then that sounds like a good plan. I mean, I don't know. You got anything to add to that?
I think that where it starts is being willing to have the conversation. I think we see so many people come at it from a different place where, again, really well intended, people are so anxious about saying the wrong thing that they don't say anything at all. And for lots of people, I, you know, in the courses that I deliver, I will openly share with people that I'm more than up for those conversations. You know, I have a really lovely friend who is trans, and we've worked together quite a bit, and they'll openly share that they're really happy with the right kind of, you know, permission requested to have those conversations, because if we don't have those conversations, if we don't talk about it, nothing changes. But being willing to reflect on the idea that maybe I got that wrong, it doesn't mean I'm a terrible person, it doesn't mean I went out of my way to hurt that person, but if I can offer them a different experience where I don't make them feel like that, why wouldn't I? You know, why wouldn't I do that?
Absolutely. And I think, you know, that it's a great conversation. And just by people listening to this podcast, hopefully it'll just start them thinking about how we can support people and include people, irrespective of their gender or their sexuality, or whether they like rice or mashed potatoes. It doesn't really matter, does it? What we do with all our guests on the Behaviour Smart podcast, we ask them to share with us either their most embarrassing moment or their claim to fame. So I think we'll start with you, Jack. Your most embarrassing moment or your claim to fame, whichever one you want to share.
I'm going to go with claim to fame. I went to university in London. I was desperate for something new and a kind of new place and a new environment. And I somehow made friends with people that ran circles in the events industry, and for some unknown reason I got invited to the world premiere in Leicester Square of the Minions movie. I got there late in true Jack style. I turned up accidentally late and I got shoved in this sort of side door, and all I could think about after a wobbly day was where I could get a drink. And I went to the bar, and there was a lady stood there who said, "Oh my goodness, get me a drink before this thing starts." And I thought, oh, I share that feeling. And I turned around and it was Sandra Bullock, and she handed me her champagne before she took her own.
Oh, wow. So you had champagne with Sandra Bullock at the Minions movie.
Wonderful woman.
Fantastic. And Matthew, can you beat that with either your claim to fame or your most embarrassing moment?
I just feel like my life's an embarrassing moment. I can only think of one, and it was when I fell down a flight of stairs in a nightclub. But I got pushed, and I thought, you're not making me fall, so I just grabbed down and fell down the flight of stairs.
Brilliant. Have you maybe had a drink?
I had a lot of drink.
I thought you might have. Okay. Thanks a lot, you two, for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure.
This was the Behaviour Smart podcast, brought to you by Behaviour Smart, the incident recording system that improves behaviour. Join us next time, and thanks for listening.